Well, hey, good morning, everybody. Welcome to The Crossing. If we haven't had a chance to meet yet, my name is Andrew. I'm the lead pastor here at The Crossing. And if you are new, I'd love to meet you at the end of the service out at Guest Connect. And if you are new, I think you picked a great weekend to be here because we are in week 2 of this series that we're calling More Than Mortals. And if you missed last week, here's what you got to know. Is last week we talked about what happens when you find out God has more in store for your life. What happens when you find out that it doesn't matter your background, your history, the mistakes you've made, your ethnicity? What happens when you find out that God has something more planned for your one life? I mean, stories like this are found throughout the entire Bible. Like one day, Jesus is walking down a road, and he meets a guy by the name of Zacchaeus. And if you grew up in Sunday school, you probably know 2 things about Zacchaeus. One, he was a tax collector, and the second is Zacchaeus was a wee little man. There's like a whole song about it. You meet this man named Zacchaeus. Small man, small heart. But Zacchaeus meets Jesus, and Jesus calls Zacchaeus to something more. And his life is changed. And so you read this story, and Zacchaeus, he gives away vast amounts of his wealth, all to the poor. And he does this because he believes God has something more in store for his life than just simply making more money in his life. You see, God calls us to more. This happens throughout all of history. In fact, a few hundred years after Zacchaeus, there was a Roman emperor by the name of Julian. And this Roman emperor, the most powerful man in the ancient world, he decides he wants to eliminate Christianity. And so he outlaws it. And he begins to arrest and beat and kill Christians. But you see, the more he persecutes Christianity, the more these little outposts of the Christian faith, they pop up. These little communities start springing up all over the ancient world. And so this emperor is just so frustrated by this that he writes to one of his friends. And he writes this about Christianity, about how Christianity keeps growing. He says, "The Christian faith has advanced through the loving service rendered to strangers. It is a scandal," he writes, "that the godless Galileans," these are what he called Christians back then, "the godless Galileans, they care not only for their own poor, but for ours as well." I mean, this emperor 1,700 years ago writes this letter in frustration about how Christianity is impossible to destroy because these followers of Jesus, they don't act like other people. They aren't afraid of what other people are afraid of. These Christians, these followers of Jesus, they have found something more for their lives. Meeting Jesus calls us to something more. This brings me to the question I want to talk about today. And the question is simply this: is this still true? You know, are Christians, are followers of Jesus still known today for the impact that their lives make? You know, are they known for things like love and radical inclusivity? Are they known for generosity to the poor? I mean, let's take our lives. Let's say, for instance, you have someone move into either your apartment complex or into your neighborhood, and let's say they find out that you are part of a church community. And I know some of you are new and you're just checking it out, but let's say you stick around here for a while and you like it and you become a follower of Jesus. And let's say one day you're having a conversation with a neighbor and they find out that you attend a church. I mean, what would their first response be? Would they be like, "Yes, I'm so glad I have a neighbor who is a follower of Jesus. Like, this is such great news for our block or our apartment complex"? Or if they found out you attended church, would they kind of give you a weird look and be like, "Really? Like, you wake up early on Sundays when you don't have to? And you go to a place you don't have to go?" Like, what would their response be? A few weeks ago, I was in an Uber, and the driver was chatting me up, which was great. We were having a great conversation, and then he asked the question that everyone always asks when you run out of things to talk about. He says, "What do you do for a living?" And so I told him, "I'm a pastor." And his response was, "Oh." That's it. Not like, "Oh, that's amazing. Tell me so much more about it." It was like the, "Oh," kind of "oh." And I can't prove this, but I'm pretty sure as he's sitting in the front seat, he is just replaying the conversation we just had for the last 5 minutes and thinking, oh my gosh, how many times did I just drop the F-bomb in front of a pastor in my car, right? What are Christians known for today? What are we known for? What are they known for? A few years ago, there was a guy by the name of Dave Kinnaman, and he did some groundbreaking research on this topic. In fact, he put it in a book. It's called Unchristian. And for it, he interviewed hundreds of people who don't consider themselves Christians or followers of Jesus, and here's what he found. He found that 49% of people outside of the church, 49%, they have a negative view of Christians. He found that 48% of people outside of the church have a neutral view of Christians. That means just 3% of people outside of the Christian faith have a positive view about Christianity. I mean, this right here is alarming. In fact, according to his research, the words most commonly associated with Christianity today are the words hypocritical, anti-gay, and judgmental. Those are the words that Christians are known for today. And I know, because I know some of you guys, I know some of you have had experiences like this firsthand. In fact, a while back, I was having a conversation with someone, just a friend of mine, and she was telling me her story. And she grew up going to church. She attended every single week with her single mom. And then she told me in 7th grade, her single mom got pregnant. And this was a big deal back then, and especially in this little church community. And this friend of me, she starts relaying this conversation. And she tells me how after her mom got pregnant, she would show up to church, and everyone would treat her mom different. As a 7th grader, she saw the way people looked at her mom, the way people whispered behind their back, the way they treated her like a second-class citizen. And so we're having this conversation, and then she looks me square in the eyes, and she just says to me, Andrew, I will never go to church after that. Never. I mean, some of you have firsthand experiences of feeling like you don't fit in, or like you show up and you feel judged or unwelcome. I mean, for some of you here today, and some of you outside as well, some of you, it took all the courage you have to simply show up today, to simply take a shot and give church another try. And here's what I want you to hear. If that's you, I want you to know how glad I am that you took a risk today. Because here's what we're going to do for our remaining few minutes. We are going to talk about the one thing that most churches and most families and most people are missing in their lives. We're going to talk about the one thing God wants to see more of in our church and in our lives and in our community today. And so here's what I'd love to ask is if you brought a Bible with you, I want you to turn to Philippians chapter 1. If you didn't bring a Bible, that's great. You can actually go to the app Justin just talked about a minute ago, and you can just click on the little Bible icon, and it'll take you right to the passage we're in today. But we are going to be in Philippians chapter 1. We're going to be in Philippians chapter 1. Now, a little background is this letter is written by a guy by the name of Paul. Now, Paul is the founding pastor of this church in the city of Philippi. And so, God brings this little group of people together, and Paul writes them a letter. Paul writes a letter to a group of people that look, act, and are a lot like us. And here's what he says in verse 9. He writes to this little church, and he says, verse 9, and this is my prayer, that your love may abound more and more in knowledge and depth of insight. And so Paul, this pastor, he starts this letter with a prayer. And he says, I want to pray for one thing, just one thing. Now, you think about all the things a pastor could pray about for a church. I mean, you could pray like, I'm praying that God gives you an amazing building. Or I'm praying that God gives you great leadership. Or I'm praying that some really wealthy or famous people show up to your church, or I'm praying for great music, or I'm praying for great preaching. I mean, Paul could pray for any of those things, but instead he prays for simply one thing. He says, I'm praying that love would abound more. You see, the more God had in store for this little church, the more God has in store for us today, it begins with this word, love. Let love abound. Now, I know you and I, we don't usually use the word abound very often anymore. Now, this little word abound, it carries the idea of something springing up in unexpected places. Let me illustrate it this way. About 6 months ago, I was in my backyard, and I started noticing these little spiders. And you got to know this about me. I am not a spider person. I hate spiders. They are gross and disgusting. And I know some of you, you're like, but Andrew, spiders are so important for, the environment, blah, 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 blah. I don't need to hear it. I don't need emails. Like, spiders are gross. I grew up in Chicago, and we have this thing in Chicago, we call it winter. I know many of you have never experienced winter, but in Chicago, you have this snow on the ground, and it kills spiders the way God intended it to be. So when I see spiders in my backyard, I am not a fan of that. And so I see these little spiders, and so I kill them, and so I apologize if that hurts your feelings, but I did, and that's just how the story goes. And so I killed them. And the next night I go out to my backyard, and what do I see? I see a few more of these little spiders. So I kill them again. Next day, same thing happens. And I start noticing after like 4 or 5 days, like no matter how many of these stupid spiders I kill, more just keep popping up. And so I do what any rational person would do at this point, is I take a photo of one with my phone and I post it on Facebook to find out what kind of a spider this is. So I get like 500 crazy responses, and I get one sane person who tells me, these are brown widow spiders. Now, brown widow spiders are poisonous, right? Now you don't feel so bad that I'm killing them, do you? And so this person tells me, like Andrew, like it's good that you're killing them because you have young kids. However, what you really need to do is you need to start looking for the brown widow eggs. And he sent me a photo, and the photo looked kind of like this, right? Aren't you so glad you came to church today, everybody? He says, look for these little egg sacs that are sticky with those little spikes on it. And so my wife and I, we went outside, and we began to look for these brown widow eggs. And I'll tell you, we found them everywhere. I mean, we looked underneath some of our kids' toys that they had left outside, and what did we find? These little eggs. We looked under our patio table, and what did we find? Brown widow eggs. We looked under our patio chairs, and we found more. We looked in bushes, we found more. I mean, these little eggs were everywhere. And so we began to destroy them. And then the next day we'd go out and we'd find more. And then we'd find more. And then we'd find more. You see, these brown widow spiders, they abounded in my backyard. I mean, they were everywhere. And no matter how many we killed, no matter how many we found and destroyed, they would continue to spring up in new places every single day. And so do you want to know what my wife and I did? We moved. No, I'm just kidding. We actually did move, but not because of the brown widow spiders. Here's the idea that Paul's saying. We can pull that off the screen. That's so gross. Paul is saying in this verse, he's saying, let your love abound. Let your love be like brown widow spiders. Let it just show up in unexpected places. Let it be impossible to destroy. Let your love abound. And I know you and I, we hear something like this, and we want that for ourselves, right? We don't want the brown widow spiders, but we do want love. We want to be known as people who are loving and kind and generous people. Like, we want people to remember us this way, don't we? But here's what happens. We have this desire, and you sit in a room like this, and you have these feelings of like, I want to be a loving person. But then what happens to you and me is we have to go out into the real world. And then within a few minutes, you're cut off in traffic. And you all of a sudden, you don't feel so loving anymore. Or then you go to Target, and you're standing in line behind that one person who digs through their purse for 5 minutes for one 50-cent off coupon, right? And you're like, I don't feel so loving anymore. You and I, we want to be a loving person until we go on Facebook. And then we see that one person we know that all they do is post political posts, and they're so stupid and wrong, and they just drive us up the wall. You and I, we want to be a loving person, but then we sit around the dinner table, and our spouse makes that chewing sound that just drives us crazy, doesn't it? You see, you and I, we want to be loving people, but then we actually have to interact with people. And people can be difficult to love, can't they? I mean, right here, those of you inside and outside, right here, how many of you, this is church, so you be honest here, how many of you have a difficult person to love in your life? Could be a neighbor, a coworker, someone at the gym. Right, show your hands, keep them up there. Just how many of us, look around. Yeah, almost all of us have a difficult person. All right, hands down. All right, how many of you are sitting next to your difficult person right now? Just kidding. Don't raise your hand for that one. We all have difficult people to love in our lives. Some of you guys know, Justin talked about it, we're kicked off small groups this last week. Some of you, if you've been around for a little while, you know one of the things I always say about small groups is every small group has one difficult person to love, right? Every group has one. And so this week, when you're sitting around in small group, I want you to look around the table, and I want you to identify who is the difficult person to love. And here's why. Because if you do not see them, who is the difficult person to love? You are, right? All of us find people in our lives who are simply difficult to love. And so here's what I want to do in just our remaining few minutes today. Today we're going to get very, very practical. Because sometimes, here's what I know. Sometimes you can go to church and you can hear a message and you can walk out and you can kind of be fuzzy about what was talked about. You cannot really be sure. Today will not be one of those days. Today, at the end of the message, you will know without a doubt that this message was about how do we make sure love abounds? How do you and I go throughout our everyday life and make sure we are growing in our capacity to love people? Because here's what we know. We know that if you want to experience the more God has in store for your life, if you want the more God has in store for you, it always begins with love. The more we love, the more we see God work in our lives. And so today we're going to talk about just two little things, two little everyday things you and I can do to make sure love abounds in our lives. And so if you haven't been taking notes until this point, I would encourage you do that. Take it on the app, write it down. But I'm going to talk about just two little things we can do. First one is simply this, is that love moves towards. Love moves towards. Let's look at verse 9 again. Paul says, and this is my prayer. This is the one thing I'm praying for, that your love may abound more and more. And then he has this phrase, in knowledge and depth of insight. Now, when you and I see the word knowledge, most of us, we think about things that we have learned over the years, usually things in school. And most of us, we grew up in a school environment where knowledge means you have to learn a lot of facts so that you can regurgitate that for a test and get a good grade. Like that's a lot of our experience with learning. But you got to understand, Paul is this Hebrew author. And so he comes from a very different culture. And in Paul's day, in Paul's culture, knowledge is based on experience. Knowledge is experience. Let me illustrate it this way. Some of you know this. I went to seminary. And in seminary, you have to learn a lot of facts about the Bible. You got to learn a lot of geography about Israel. That's where Jesus spent his life. And so for years, I learned all sorts of facts about, I had to learn all the geography, all the important cities. And, there's a lot of information I had to learn. Now, my junior year or my third year of seminary, I actually had a chance to go to Israel. I got a chance to experience some of the same streets Jesus walked on. I got to see some of the same hills and mountains and lakes that Jesus walked, saw, he took a boat across. And it changed the way I saw it. In fact, it opened my eyes to a greater experience and understanding of the life that Jesus lived. You see, this is what Paul is talking about here. Knowledge is based on experience. And so if you and I, if we want to grow in our love for people, what do we need to do? We need to be in relationship with them. We need to experience what they are experiencing. Stephen Covey is this famous author. And in one of his books, he writes a story about one day being on a subway car in New York. And he says he's sitting there, and it's really quiet on the subway train. And this family enters. And this dad sits down and closes his eyes. And this dad has a couple of little boys. And these kids just go crazy on this subway car. I mean, they are yelling and screaming and hitting and running into passengers and knocking stuff down. So Stephen Covey says, he's like sitting there, and he's like starting to get really frustrated and agitated. And he like does the, try to like help the dad know, hey, like your kids are out of control. But the dad like doesn't respond, and the kids are just getting worse and worse and worse. And so eventually he turns to the dad and he says, "Excuse me, sir. Like, do you think you should do something about your children? They're being very disruptive." And this dad opens his eyes and looks at Stephen Covey, and he says, "Oh, I'm so sorry." And he tells Stephen Covey the story about how their family is going through this very, very difficult season. And they've just suffered a loss of someone in their family, and the kids don't know what to do, and he doesn't know what to do. And so Stephen Covey, he listens to the story, and he writes about it later. He says, "This moment on this subway train, it was a paradigm shift for me." He says, until this moment, I was frustrated and annoyed because I didn't have all the information. I didn't know what this family was going through. I didn't know the pain or the loss in their lives. But you know what? The moment I did, this is what he writes, the moment I did, I understood them, and I didn't have to try to be patient. I didn't have to try to be compassionate. It just came out of me because I knew their story. See, what Paul is saying here is as we experience people, as we move towards them, you know what happens? We develop a kind of love and compassion for them. We understand them better. And this is something you and I, we could do this week. Some of you, you just raise your hands. Some of you, you have a difficult person in your life. Some of you, you could choose this week, instead of being frustrated and annoyed with them, you could choose to move towards them. You could take them out for coffee. You could buy them lunch. You could hear a little bit of their story. And I promise you, when you do, you will see your love for that person grow. And it doesn't just have to be for difficult people. You could do it for other people. You could do it for people that you don't know very well. I mean, I know, sitting here, some of you, you sit in the same seat every single week. And you sit near the same people every single week. And every week when we do that little turn and greet, you say the same thing. You're like, "Great weather today, huh?" "Yeah, great weather." You have the same 15-second conversation. Today, here's what you could do. You could, at the end of the service, have a 5-minute conversation with someone. You could learn their name. You could hear what brought them to the crossing. And you could just say, ask them one question about themselves. And you will be surprised how just a little connection, just choosing to move towards someone, how it will impact your relationships. You can let love abound. This is something you and I can do this very week. We can move towards people in our lives. Second thing love does, love wants the best for others. We see this in the verse 10. Verse 9, again, this is Paul's prayer. He says that your love may abound more and more in knowledge and depth of insight. So that you, this is it right here, so that you may be able to discern what is best. Look at that phrase, discern what is best. If you want to see love grow in your lives, you have to want the best for other people. You see, love actively works toward the betterment of other people. Now, notice what Paul does not say. He does not say love gives people exactly what they want, right? Does not say this. I have 2 kids, 4, and my other one's almost 6. And so here's my kids' dream day. If my kids could choose anything for a given day, here's what it would be. They would wake up and they would get to eat cinnamon rolls for breakfast, which who wouldn't want to eat cinnamon rolls for breakfast? Then after breakfast, they would get to watch a movie. Then after a movie, they'd get to play on their iPad. Then for lunch, they would have chocolate chip pancakes with syrup and sprinkles for lunch. Then after lunch, they'd have a chance to play a little bit. And then for dinner, their dream would be to have just ice cream. Like that, for them, that is their dream day. Do you want to know how often I give my kids their dream day? Never. Unless my wife's out of town. Then who knows? But as a dad, here's what I know. I know what's best for my kids is that they need to eat something green. They need to eat some vegetables from time to time. I know my kids need exercise and vitamins. I know that my kids, it's not good for them if they have unlimited screen time. So love discerns what is best for people. This is what love does in our lives as well. Meaning, if you want to love someone well, you need to actively help them to become the best version of themselves. And here's how we do it. Often, we'll do it simply by highlighting or taking notice of people when they are making a difference. For example, we have a volunteer at our church. Some of you know her. Her name's Yonda. And Yonda has been serving at our church in our nursery for 31 years. 31 years. Isn't that incredible? She's right here on your left. And so this week we did a little math of if she served 31 years, that she has spent 2,000 hours in the nursery here. Meaning that she has given up the equivalent of 1 year of full-time work to serve every family that shows up to our church. I mean, you think about how many families come through on a given year. And how many parents, and especially she serves in the nursery. If you have kids and you have a baby, you know how terrifying it is that first moment to hand your baby over to someone else. Yonda has spent 31 years making sure every time a parent does that, they feel safe. They feel like their child is going to be loved on and cared for. She has spent 31 years making sure that our kids ministry is running as a top-notch kids ministry. I mean, she spent 31 years. I mean, that is something that deserves to be celebrated. There's a lot of other things you could do with your time, but she has chosen to make a difference. See, if you want to love people well, you need to catch them doing something good and simply highlight it. I mean, here's something you could do today. If you have kids and TC kids, at the end of the service today, when you go pick them up, you could take a minute and you could thank a volunteer. You could tell them what a difference they make in your kid's life, or how their kids look forward to showing up every single week. Or if you're brand new here and there was someone who welcomed you and you felt pretty good after that, like you felt like a good connection with them, you could find them after the service and just say the words, thank you to them. When you go home today, and by some miracle, your kids actually take their dirty clothes and put them in a laundry basket, right? Like some act of God happens and that occurs in your house, you thank your kids. Your spouse does something kind to serve you. You tell them how much that means to you. See, you and I, we can do this, right? This is just a little moment. And then another little moment. See, you and I, we can move towards the people in our lives. We can move towards them. And we can call them towards being the best version of themselves. And I know some of you're sitting there today and you're like, Andrew, this is way too easy. All right, you're like, you want to change how people, view each other, how people interact, or how people view churches. It's going to take a whole lot more than these little acts to change things, right? Here's what I'll tell you. So often in life, it's these little moments where God shows up. So often, it's the little moments where the God who has something more in store for you, where he shows up. There's a famous fictional story. It was written about 40 years ago. And it's about a teacher by the name of Mrs. Thompson and a student that she did not particularly like by the name of Teddy Stoddard. And the story begins this way. It says, Teddy did not play well with others. His clothes were often a mess. He was disruptive, rude, and just unpleasant to be around. And it got to the point where Mrs. Thompson, his teacher, where she kind of took delight in putting a lot of red ink on his papers, just so that Teddy would know he wasn't doing very well in school. Now, about halfway through the year, Mrs. Thompson came across Teddy's file, and she noticed Teddy's first grade teacher wrote, Teddy is a delight to be around. His second grade teacher wrote, Teddy is an excellent student, well liked by others, but he is troubled because his mother is very sick. Life at home must be a struggle for him. Teddy's third grade teacher wrote, Teddy's mother's death has been hard on him. He tries his best, but his father doesn't show much interest. Teddy's fourth grade teacher wrote, Teddy is withdrawn and doesn't show much interest in school. Well, by now, Mrs. Thompson realized the problem, and she was ashamed of herself. She felt even worse that year when her students brought her Christmas presents, wrapped in these beautiful ribbons and bright paper, everyone except for Teddy's. Teddy brought her a present that was clumsily wrapped in a heavy brown paper that he had gotten from a grocery bag. Now, Mrs. Thompson was quite careful to open his present in the middle of all the other presents. And when she opened it, some of the children started to laugh when she found an old rhinestone bracelet with some stones missing and a bottle of cheap perfume that was only about a quarter full. But she stifled the children's laughter when she exclaimed how pretty the bracelet was. And putting it on, and then she dabbed some of the perfume on her wrist. Now, Teddy stayed after school that day just long enough to say the words, Mrs. Thompson, today you smelled just like my mom used to. And after that, she cried. Now, after that day, Mrs. Thompson, she paid particularly close attention to Teddy. And as she worked with him, she began to see something good in him. His mind seemed to come alive. In fact, the more she encouraged him, the faster he responded. By the end of the year, Teddy had become one of the smartest children in her class. Now, fast forward 6 years, and Mrs. Thompson got a letter from Teddy. And he wrote that he had finished high school. He was third in his class. 4 years after that, she received another letter saying that while things had been tough at times, he would soon graduate from college with the highest of honors. Well, one day another letter arrived, and this time Teddy said he had met a girl, and they were going to get married. And in this letter, he asked Mrs. Thompson if she might come to the wedding and sit in the seat reserved for the mother of the groom. And of course she did. And she wore that old rhinestone bracelet and some of the perfume that she had been given years before. And when he thanked her for being the best teacher he ever had, she could only whisper, Teddy, you have it all wrong. You were the one who taught me. See, this little story was written by a woman by the name of Elizabeth Ballard. Some of you are probably familiar with it. She was interviewed about this story, and she said that there were 2 life events that triggered her to write this story that has been told and retold countless times. The first, she said, was years before when she was teaching a Sunday school class. Because you see, Elizabeth Ballard is a follower of Jesus. She is a follower of the man who said, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. And she said that once in her Sunday school class, there was a little boy whose clothes did not fit right, whose family did not have money. And one day he showed up to her class and he brought her a present. A rhinestone bracelet with some stones missing and a bottle of cheap perfume, which reminded her of a second event about how when she was just a little girl, she grew up in a very poor family with no money at all. And one year she gave her teacher a few pecans from a tree in her yard. And when all the other students began to laugh at her, her teacher stopped them by saying he was going to make a fruit cake, and these pecans were exactly what he needed. Now, of course, you and I, we know that this teacher was lying because no one actually wants to make fruitcake. No one No one has actually ever eaten fruitcake. But for Elizabeth Ballard, she never forgot this little moment. She never forgot this small act of love from a teacher. See, friends, you never know. You never know when one small act of kindness, you never know when one conversation, you never know when one caring word, you never know when one act of grace, you never know when one moment of love can change someone's life. You never know how God will use you to change someone. And so it is with us this week. You know, in just a minute, you and I, we are going to leave this place. And we are going to go throughout our day. And we're going to do all the errands and tasks you and I have on our lists today. But here's what else I know. I know that today there will be a moment where God calls you to something more. I know that there will be a moment when God gives you a chance to love someone by simply moving towards them, or to love someone by calling out the best in them. And you never know. You never know how God will use that moment to change a life. You know, for Paul, 2,000 years ago on the other side of the world, he writes this little church in Philippi. And he has one prayer for them. His prayer is that love would abound. And so this week, we're going to close our service in a minute. And I want you to know that this week, I and our staff are going to be praying for you. And we are going to be praying that love would abound in your lives. And so here's how I want to close our service today. On our way in, each of you were given a piece of paper. On the very bottom, it says, what's your more? So you can pull this out from your bulletin. Some of you were handed that on your way in. If you didn't get one, you can just lift up your hand. We'll have some guest hosts, so we'll bring it to you. But each of you, you were given this piece of paper. And it just asks a simple question. What is your more? And here's my hunch. My hunch is today, as I've been talking, there is a person that's just their image or just a situation you were in with them this week that just popped into your mind. And here's what I believe. I believe that's God's way of saying to you, this week, the more I have in store for you is to love that person. And so what I want to ask of you today is I want you to just simply write their name on this piece of paper. Just write their name. As a person pops into your head, you could write that they're your brother or sister or neighbor or coworker or whatever. Just don't even need last names, just a first name. Just who they are. You can write that down now. And I also know, for some of you, you've been sitting here today, and if you got real honest, if we sat down for coffee this week, you'd tell me, Andrew, I don't think I've ever experienced love like this. I don't know if I've ever had someone who's called out the best in me. I don't know if I've ever had someone who's moved towards me in a season of pain. For you, maybe the name you want to just write down on this piece of paper, you may just want to write me. I am the person in desperate need of this love. And if that's you, we have staff who this week we are going to pray for you. And so in a minute, we're going to dismiss after I pray. And right outside, you'll see there's a statue. And the statue, you'll see some letters on it. It says, God is greater than our ups and downs. And I want you to roll up this little piece of paper, and I just want you to stick it in the fence. And we will pray for you this week that love may abound. Now, in a second, before we pray, though, I want to say one more thing. I want to speak to those of you who are here today. And maybe you've been around for a little while, and you are just checking out faith. Maybe this is your very first time here. Maybe you just saw the sign, and you have no idea why you're here today. Here's what I think. I think God brought you here because he wants you to know that you are loved, that you are cared for. You see, the greatest image we have of love comes from Jesus. You know, we're in this series on this book of Philippians. And just a few verses after this prayer, Paul gives us the greatest example of love. In Philippians chapter 2, verse 7, Here's what he writes. He says, this is Jesus, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he, Jesus, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. You see, the reason you and I, we are called to love, the reason we are called to make sure our love abounds, that we love more and more and more, is because we worship a God whose love abounds. We worship a God who loves in unexpected ways and in unexpected moments. And there is no death, there is no loss that can take this love from you. And so in a minute when I pray, I'm going to give some of you who are ready to say yes to Jesus for the very first time, I'm going to give you an opportunity. Today could be the day that your life is changed by the love of Jesus. And when it happens, and when your life is changed, your next step is to go out into this world and to make sure that love abounds. And so here's how I want to close our service right now. Those of you inside and out, I want to ask that you all bow your heads, and we can all close our eyes. So God, we come before you today, and God, we thank you. We thank you that for many of us, there was a moment where you changed our life. There is a moment when you moved towards us. There is a moment where you called us to our best. There is a moment where you forgave us and you sacrificed everything for us. And so now here's our prayer, God. We pray for every person in this room who is on the fence of saying yes to you for the first time. And now here's what I want to ask. With all of your heads bowed and your eyes closed, I want to ask if any of you in this room or outside, if you're ready to say yes to Jesus for the first time. If you want to experience his love and forgiveness, I just want to ask where you're sitting right now, with no one looking around but me, to just simply, quietly raise your hand up right now. You can do that right here. Yeah. Lift them up high. God sees every hand. You can lower your hand right now. God, we thank you that you are a God who calls us to something more. That you are a God who loves us more than we could ever hope or imagine. And today, God, as we leave this place, God, here is our prayer. Let love abound more and more. God, use us to call people to you. God, we love you. We are so grateful for you. And we pray this in your son's name. Amen. Amen. Well, hey, everyone, thanks so much for being here. Have a great week. We'll see you this week on Wednesday for small groups. Enjoy, everybody.